Hello, everyone. Welcome to my lecture on the global rise in right wingism and authoritarianism, presented by yours truly, Rodrigo Trujillo. In this lecture, we're just going to talk about a couple of things in regards to the general values of the right, things that they care about, authoritarianism, and what it looks like modern and global perspective. And if you're wondering why you're watching this lecture, I think it's because um, things like political ideologies and systems like authoritarianism are very, very, very applicable to a lot of different motions, especially international relations motions. And I think that you're going to like end up like getting a lot out of this and finding that right wingism actually applies to so many motions, and you can make arguments almost in every single debate that like you run into. But yeah, so let's waste no time. Here's what we're going to be going over. By the way, that's in Spanish because this was a Spanish template. I forgot to change it. But if you see Spanish, that's why. But anyway, here are the four things we're going to talk about. Firstly, we're going to talk about the intro to the right wing. What is right wingism? How does it differ from region to region? What are certain places that are experiencing surges in the right wing ideology? Secondly, we'll go over modern authoritarianism, how authoritarianism looks like right now, and how authoritarian countries come to be. And then we'll talk about how to apply this to rounds, go over things like potential arguments, some refutation to those arguments, and then we'll finalize with some resources that I think would help everyone out. So, firstly, let's talk about the intro to right wingism and right wing based thought. So, for a brief introduction, I think that you should view right wingism as a political and social ideology that views social hierarchies as necessary or acceptable, while emphasizes things such as order, duty, and individual freedoms. Right? This is like a very, I think this is a very restrictive definition, but it's also like enough to where it'll work for the lecture, right? But I think there are two pillars of right wing based thought, right? And like when it comes to the right wing and just conservative Republican based thought, there are very, very, very different ideologies and like sometimes conflicting opinions, right? Because you have right wing populists who are very different from like the far right, or conservatives in America who are very, very different from the right wing in like Brazil or in Europe. And so I think that all of those different ideologies have different like values, different characteristics, but it does not matter where you're from, which type of like ideology you fit into. Insofar as you are right leaning, then there are two pillars that your ideology relies on. Firstly is neoliberalism, and secondly is individualism, right? And this is just inherent to anybody who supports the right wing. So, firstly, on neoliberalism, neoliberalism is just a contemporary view of the free market that advocates for reforms that minimize regulations in the markets, especially state influence, right? Things like free trade, no price controls, lower taxes, etc. Anything that makes the market freer is generally something that those on the right wing are going to support because of their opposition to state influence, state intervention in the markets, or just restrictive and small markets in general, right? But the second thing is individualism. And individualism is this sort of like train of thought that emphasizes self-reliance and views individuals as independent to one another and each other. And individualism prioritizes the interests and goals of the individual over that of the collective, and believes that the only thing responsible for like your journey is yourself, right? And so oftentimes you'll see individualists or those on the right talk about things like valuing individual freedoms over that of the collective, and those are sort of like like hyper individualism that we see on the right. But even further, I think there are a couple of inherent characteristics that kind of like fit into other or certain ideologies like right wing populists more than they would fit into like the far right. But either way, I think they're very, very important characteristics that you guys should remember. The first thing is about limited government, right? Now, the people who strongly support the right also strongly oppose large governments because they think that the government's role in the markets should be extremely, extremely minimal, right? They don't like government intervention in the markets. They don't like government intervention in the individual's life in the private sphere, and they like especially hate government intervention in like freedoms, right? Individual freedoms, like your right to freely practice religion, your right to do whatever, right? The second thing, though, is like individual freedoms, right? These people on the right love their freedoms, namely constitutional freedoms, things that are highlighted in like doctrines and constitutions and inherent human rights. And what's notable about this is that they care more about individual freedoms than they do over collective freedoms and rights. Therefore, they're always going to value the interests of individuals over that of the collective. And we saw this in the United States with like mask mandates, where certain people on the right and certain Republicans were like, I'm not going to wear a mask, that's infringing on my rights, even if that was bad for the general collective rights or the general like collective population, right? The next thing is about the rule of law, right? And those on the right characteristically care a lot about laws, and they see laws as absolute, right? In most cases. And they typically use laws and what's legal and illegal to shape their moral compass and like kind of like guide their ethics, right? So, for example, if marijuana is illegal, they automatically assume and internalize that marijuana is inherently bad because it's illegal. And this is also why the right will almost always support things like greater police presence, more prisons, more capacity for prisons, etc. They're more punitive. They're more like strict with the rule of law, and they respect the law a lot. And the last thing, and I'm not sure if this is inherent to the right, but it's very, very common, and it's just like the value of interventionism, where they value upholding rights so much, even if they really don't, but that they'll support vast action to like uphold those rights. They'll support things like military intervention, economic sanctions, coup d'etats, whatever, all in the name of helping people who are like getting their rights abused, whatever. And this is like more so supported by the right than any other like political ideology. Some more important characteristics though that aren't necessarily inherent are things like religious beliefs, traditional social values, and like the value of anti-establishment sentiment, right? So first on religious belief, like it's like no surprise that people on the right are overwhelmingly religious, and they often use their strong religious beliefs to kind of shape their interpretations of what the role of the government should be, i.e. things like small governments equals more religious freedoms. So because a religious person likes religious freedoms, they're going to support small government and are more likely to be Republican, right? Or they think that things like same-sex marriage is bad and therefore being gay should be illegal, or same-sex marriage should be illegal, whatever, right? The next thing is about traditional and social values, right? And those on the right and that are right leaning are like more traditional in terms of social like social progress, I guess. That's why in terms of like gender norms, they're going to proudly support things like the patriarchy or deny the existence of the patriarchy, and like reinforce things like gender norms such as like those traditional like understandings of masculinity and femininity, and things like neopronouns, gender fluidity, sexual orientation, all that jazz isn't like in their dictionary. They don't know what that means and they don't support it. They just support how life was like 100 years ago, whatever, right? And the right is typically in opposition to changing these social aspects, or they play an active role in reinforcing regressive social aspects because they believe that this sort of progress is regress. And so the last thing is just anti-establishment like sentiment. Like the right characteristically has like distrust in institutions. They don't trust the government. They don't trust elections. They don't trust elected officials. They don't trust empirics. All of these things mean that the right is just generally characteristically more skeptical towards the evidence and things that are set in front of them. And all of these characteristics come to form voter blocks in the United States that support the right wing, right? So these voters are typically, or like 80% of the right wing voters in the US are white, 56% of them are over the age of 50, 30% of them are like don't have a degree or are Christian and things like that. So an extremely large majority of them are cisgendered and straight. Like these are just the sort of demographics that we see right-wing voter blocks have in the US, right? Now, how do they actually act when it comes to elections, right? I think that they usually have an because an overwhelming amount of them are actually uneducated, it makes it easy for them to like bite into conspiracy theories, believe disinformation or misinformation or misleading information, things like that. But they also have massive distrust in governments, and they believe that progress is regress. So if like if like I don't know, if Bernie Sanders was like, oh, we have to like implement like free healthcare and stuff like that, they believe that that sort of progress is actually regressive because it does not align with their value or their idea of what progress should be, right? And also, most notably, they vote reactively, which means usually the right wing only mobilizes in response to something bad that happens. So if like Obama passed Obamacare, they would mobilize because they're like, my taxes went up, I am going to vote now, whatever, right? Like this is kind of like how their voting patterns have been before. So like what issues do they care most about? This is probably common sense to like a lot of us, but like this is like a list of things that they probably care about. So if you get motions about any of these topics, you can probably find some way to apply it, right? They care about things like abortion, same-sex marriage, religious freedoms, right to bear arms, interventionism, the free market, strengthening police, lower taxes, economy, anti-drugs, prisons, nationalisms, national security, immigration, etc. I think on top of that, though, they also care about the general integrity of the government, things like democracy, things like checks and balances, all of those things that have to do with like the strength of the government, how democratic the government is, the right wing generally cares about upholding those things, especially in the United States, right? So, but outside of the United States, there are other countries that are experiencing a surge in right wingism, and I think that these are very, very good examples that you should probably use like in debate rounds, right? Like if you just like list off like two or three of these examples with like a line of analysis, you're probably already going to be ahead in like the examples department of the debate, and it also kind of just legitimizes your argument a bit, right? So in Latin America, I think one of the best examples is Peru, which right now I think like last week or 2 weeks ago they probably had like they had this election, right? Versus it was Keiko Fujimori, who is a very authoritarian far right leader, versus the super leftist candidate Pedro Castillo, who's a socialist. And Keiko Fujimori, the authoritarian, lost the election, and she's now calling electoral fraud, election fraud, saying that the election was stolen and that Pedro Castillo like stole it, did like some corruption stuff, whatever, right? And they're using very similar rhetoric to what Trump used after the loss to Biden. So these are like just individuals that or individual regions that are facing a high surge in right wingism. I think Mexico is another good example where the right wing party is gaining traction in the election, and the election is like far from over right now, but it is going to like play out probably badly for progressives because of how much traction the right wing is getting there. And Brazil is like a picture perfect example for what a bad administration looks like because Bolsonaro is literally going insane. He's already elected, if you didn't know, and he's extremely far right. He's extremely abusive, and he's just not a good leader. But honestly, a Brazil example could go both ways just because like of how bad he is as a president. He's like the right wing probably isn't going to get a lot of support in the next election. In Europe, though, I think there are a lot more examples, right? Even of like progressive countries traditionally viewed as like upstream, I don't know, like the Nordic countries and stuff. Like in Poland, they've like reversed abortion rights, making it more restrictive. And Hungary, which I think is the best example you can use, you have 49% of votes going to nationalist leaders in the last election, and like you have Viktor Orban, who's a super like far right leader, and you have Germany, who's like seen as a progressive country, but now they have a rising right wing party called the AfD, which is like now gaining much more traction in their elections, taking up much more seats in the parliament. And Sweden and Finland, which were once progressive and viewed as like progressive Nordic countries, are now facing right wing opposition and a surge of it in their elections. And Spain has this party called the Vox Party, which has 52 seats in parliament, making it the third most popular in the country, meaning that they're going to have much more influence in parliament, in the legislature, etc. And France, you have far right leaders like Marine Le Pen, who are campaigning on anti-immigration rhetoric, which plays a crucial role in why France experiences so much anti-immigration sentiment and like sentiment against immigrants in general, right? These are just I don't know, there's just a list of examples that you guys could use, and just like some kind of context for which countries are leaning more progressive, which countries are facing like a regressive political climate. I think it's quite helpful, right? Secondly, though, let's talk about modern authoritarianism. Like what causes modern authoritarianism? How does it look like in global perspective, etc., right? So I think that authoritarian can be defined as a form of government characterized by the rejection of political plurality and the use of strong central power to preserve the political status quo and reductions in the rule of law, separation of powers, democratic voting, and individual freedoms. And this is like what Wikipedia says, right? And I know what you're thinking, like, if authoritarianism like advocates for reductions in like the rule of law, separation of powers, democratic voting, and individual freedoms, this is like the opposite of what the right wants, right? Like the right cares about the separation of powers. They care about democracy. They care about individual freedoms. Why would far right authoritarianism ever like happen? And I think the real reason is just that there are sneaky ways that authoritarian governments come to consolidate power, and therefore supporters of the right don't notice it, but they are advocating for laws and policies and leaders that are actually going against their best interests, right? And so we'll get a little bit more into that, but for now, we'll talk about the three different types of authoritarianism, right? So firstly, you have oligarchic regimes, right? And an oligarchic regime is just like a party or military regime that is maintained and empowered by oligarchs, elites, and the ultra wealthy, which just means the super rich people in the country support your administration so much that they are empowering your regime, they are funding your regime in exchange for things like, I don't know, you supporting their companies, whatever, right? Next, you have the autocratic regimes, which is just a government ruled by a single absolute power, a single person, a single party, whatever, with unlimited influence and unlimited power, right? This usually looks like absolute monarchies, It looks like dictators, whatever, right? And the last one isn't really an authoritarian regime, but it's like borderline authoritarian, and it's a flawed democracy. And it's a democratic government that is experiencing phenomena that causes it to slowly regress to an authoritarian state. It's usually borderline authoritarian, and these countries like characteristically have low election integrity. They are like infringing on human rights. They are restricting things like democracy, whatever. Those are the characteristics of a flawed democracy that is like heading towards the direction of authoritarianism, right? And so now back onto this topic about creeping authoritarianism, right? So if the right wing cares so much about individual freedoms, if they care so much about the separation of powers and the rule of law, my bad, why would they ever care about, like, why would they ever want an authoritarian government, right? And the way to explain this is through democratic backsliding, right? And so democratic backsliding is just when a democratic country organically regresses back into an authoritarian state based on things like democracy, right? And it usually happens when the common people vote for policies and leaders that work against them, but they don't know that like it's not in their best interest, right? So how do countries typically democratically backslide, right? Usually it's through fear mongering or extremely bad policy that causes bad effects to a group of people, right? Most commonly, though, it's things like fear mongering tactics or a very urgent crisis that occurs that calls for some vast government like measures, right? So, for example, the US Patriot Act is like a very, very, very good example of this. So this act was like drafted in response to 9/11, what resulted in a drastic increase in surveillance in Americans, right? But people were so scared of like terrorists, they were so scared of the rhetoric that the government was saying terrorists were going to come kill them all or whatever, that they were okay with this act being drafted, and they were okay with it like with surveillance increasing, the TSA being created, whatever, right? So despite it being drafted in 2001, it's still enacted to this day with almost no criticism for the general public. It just became a part of the cultural norm of like everyday life of like whatever, right? And in any other circumstances, this drastic increase in surveillance would have been seen as abusive and an invasion of privacy. But fear mongering tactics used by the government allowed for the US to regress slowly without actually being caught or criticized in any way, shape, or form, right? And so this is kind of the same, like, although I'd argue that the US probably isn't authoritarian yet, those sort of tactics are what lead to very invasive, very abusive sort of legislation and administrations to be elected, things like fear mongering tactics or whatever, right? And this is what leads to what I like to call modern authoritarianism, because I think this is how authoritarianism takes place now without like military coups, without military intervention, whatever, right? So think about a recent crisis that's happened and impacted the globe that would lead to more authoritarianism. The very, very obvious answer is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Think about how this crisis actually leads to more authoritarian like governments, right? The urgency of COVID allows for citizens to turn a blind eye when governments consolidate power, right? Or people are so scared of death that they are okay with the government consolidating power and removing traditional checkbacks, right? So, what are some examples of this, right? I think there are three that we can look at. Firstly, in Britain, which is a more democratic country, I'd argue that this is a liberal democracy. It's not authoritarian or whatever, but they still do bad things and have still used tactics like fear mongering, right? Where the police are able to detain people suspected of having COVID, and they banned protests under the guise of curbing the spread of the virus and put 20,000 additional troops on standby for additional policing, right? This is like a very rash policy. It's very rash measures, but they're able to take it because of the urgency of COVID-19. In Hungary, Viktor Orban now has the power to suspend already existing laws. He can bypass the parliament on new laws that he doesn't like, and he can limit freedom of expression and suspend all elections and referenda. And I think that because of the COVID-19 crisis, he's able to demand these powers indefinitely, despite the initial intent actually being like as a response to the pandemic. But people just believe that this is the best, like call to action because of like how urgent the crisis actually is, right? And additionally, the new legislation also gives Orban the power to detain anyone suspected of distributing what he considers distorted information, which will land some 5 years in prison, right? This is very, very obviously authoritarian-like behavior because he is limiting freedoms and he is like he's making rash decisions, but because of things like the COVID-19 crisis, it doesn't receive that much criticism as it would otherwise, right? And in Thailand, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha has assumed authority to censor the media and journalists and threatened and sued for criticizing the government's response to the pandemic, right? These are all authoritarian-like behavior, but they aren't being criticized or they are being seen as more acceptable just because of the existence of a crisis and because of the government's fear-mongering tactics. So thirdly, let's talk about debating right wingism and authoritarianism. How do you actually apply any of the stuff that we talked about in the last like 15, 20-ish minutes to debate lands, right? And I think there are a couple of ways. The first major argument that you can make, and you can use this as an argument within of itself or just like a link, is about democratic backsliding, right? So what is democratic backsliding? I know we talked about it already, but the definition or characterization that you should give in rounds should sound something like this. Democratic backsliding is the way in which a country's citizens democratically vote for leaders, policies, etc., that cause the country to regress on the democracy index, right? Without them actually knowing, of course. So what causes it? Things like fear mongering, like we just talked about, nationalism, too much trust in the government, not enough trust in the governments. All of these things usually cause democratic backsliding because people feel the urge to show out and like vote for new leaders and new policies that promise change that might not actually be good for them, but of course they don't know that again. So, for example, if you run into a motion like this, which is this house supports the use of war rhetoric or language of war in relation to disease management, like pandemics, I think you can argue democratic backsliding occurs because you say that the urgency behind language of war results in so much fear or like a greater sense of unification. But either way, the country becomes more willing to accept irrational government measures as they believe it is the only way to solve such an issue or the best way to solve that issue, right? Then you give any of like the examples we talked about before, like Thailand, Britain, or Hungary. And there's a whole load of other examples that you could research on. And then you'd have like a solid argument, a solid link, right? Because if it's true that that things like language of war causes more democratic backsliding, then you'd argue that that is an inherent harm within of itself because democracy is going down and authoritarianism is going up, and that's very, very bad, right? This is a solid argument that you can use. But I think a more universal argument you can use is on right wing populism, right? And I can't stress this, like I cannot stress this enough. Right wing populism is the most universal argument like ever, right? Like you can apply this to any type of motion. It can be international relations motion. It can be an environmental motion. It can be a social movement motion. It could be literally anything, right? And so your argument is basically X policy or X action will cause a surge in right wing populism and backlash. So the reason this is like a super cheesy argument is just that the right wing usually gets mad at any progress made by the left, right? So if proposition ever has an intuitive side of the motion that's very, very progressive, the right wing would probably get extremely angry at that, right? And you'd make an argument about Republican backlash. So, for example, even the most intuitive motions, like intuitive proposition motions, like this has to remove all memorials to the Confederacy, you can still use a right wing backlash argument and make it quite strong, right? So, your argument would be that Republicans get super mad. They see it as a way of like Democrats erasing history or something, whatever. I don't know, whatever you think the Republican would say about this. And they backlash in two ways. Firstly, through showing out to the polls, through increased voting, which means more administrations get elected, more red candidates get elected, whatever. And secondly, through entrenching their already pre-existing notions and beliefs about certain groups, therefore entrenching things like racism, increasing things like hate crimes, etc. Right? And I think that you argue that this is like super, super bad because when you have Republican administrations elected, that comparative is more harmful for groups like people of color than having memorials to the Confederacy, like standing in parks, right? Like that is going to like lead to more material harms than like a statue of like, I don't know, Robert E. Lee, right? So that's like a good way you argue Republican backlash. And I guess those are like sort of the links that you kind of want to use, right? Another motion where I think this might be applicable is on this House would nationalize Facebook and Twitter in the United States. And this is a little bit less straightforward because, like, if you read this motion, the first thought probably isn't right wing like backlash, but the way that you're still able to argue it is just like ask yourself, if I was a conservative or if I was talking to a conservative, why would they not support this policy? Like, what would they say, right? And like, it doesn't matter if it's like a valid reason; it's just their perception of it, right? So, like, if you're talking to a Republican, they'd probably be like, "No, let's not nationalize Facebook and Twitter because that's socialism, and that's also like the government spying on me, right?" And so it doesn't matter if that's actually true. It doesn't matter if the government would actually spy on you. It doesn't matter if that's actually socialism. What does matter, though, is that the general right wing and the voting blocks that we talked about earlier would perceive this as socialism, would perceive this as government intervention. And therefore, the mere perception of that causes them to mobilize and leads to backlash in two ways. Firstly, because they move platforms, because if the government is spying on them, then they don't want to be on like Facebook and Twitter anymore. They're going to move to Telegram. They're going to move to Parler, the dark web, or whatever, which we've already seen in a lot of places like Brazil. Or they're going to vote for Republican politicians to reverse the policy and to bring back their freedoms and stuff like that. And so either way, both of these impacts are like very uniquely bad. And you argue that they happen just because of proposition's policy, right? And then you just engage on the comparative from there. But backlash is a very universal argument, right? But these are very surface level arguments. Like this is like this surface level approach to right-wing backlash arguments. The way you actually make these arguments good is to think about the trend line in your argument, right? Because the immediate response that you're going to get from people is just like, who cares? Why is this unique? The right wing will always get mad. That's not a reason to oppose progress, right? But ask yourself, why would passing this specific policy or doing this specific set of actions uniquely cause Republicans to get mad, right? And come up with the most unique reasons possible as to why this would be the tipping point, right? If we're already past the bottleneck, why would this be the tipping point that kind of like, I don't know, ignites the fuse on right-wing voter blocs? And so if we're debating the motion, this House believes that the benefits of expanding the Supreme Court outweighs the harms, you can make this right-wing surge argument on the opposition and you'll have three links, right? So ask yourself, why would the right get mad if Democrats pack the court, right? Three things that you could probably say. Firstly, it legitimizes fears of a one-party system because they get mad that the only branch that they have in control, which is the Supreme Court, is getting taken over by Democrats. Secondly, people on the right view the court as apolitical and independent, but expanding it and allowing Joe Biden to pack the court politicizes it and therefore like goes away from like the original vision of the founding fathers. And then thirdly, you'd probably say that progressive policymaking is seen as an infringement on personal liberties. So for example, maybe like last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a court case about religious freedoms in Philadelphia and like a religious institution's ability to deny service to same-sex couples, and the court sided with the religious institution. And so if we had like Democrats pack the court, that probably would have happened the other way, right? The court probably would have sided with same-sex couples. And if that would have happened, the people on the right wing would have been like, this is an infringement of my religious freedoms. This is like infringing my belief that like gay people are bad. And therefore, I'm going to like vote for the next Donald Trump or something, right? Like that is sort of the train of thought that you kind of want to use. That is sort of the language that you want to use, I guess. So the second thing though is that you want to prove why your argument actually expands the voter base, right? Because the way you make this argument super strong is by proving that that the vote like Republican voter base increases by numbers, not just intensity, right? So like it doesn't matter if you have like 1,000 Republicans and all of them get more angry because they're still going to vote Republican either way. That doesn't really change the election, right? But if you have like 1,000 Republican voters and then that 1,000 becomes 2,000, then you have a net increase and therefore that's a harm within of itself, right? So therefore, when you're making these kind of arguments about right-wing populism, think about who your stakeholder is, which is usually going to be centrist and moderate swing voters who would not vote Republican if they did not, if the proposition's policy or opposition's policy didn't pass, right? So I think that you can like use these two universal links usually, but try and add as many as you can. So like, firstly, moderates start seeing a bunch of Republican media as like Republican like media becomes more mobilized, and then they start believing more right-wing talking points, getting stuck in those echo chambers, whatever. And then secondly, moderates typically care about personal freedoms and want to vote to preserve them. So if they do like listen to the talking points by candidates about like how your freedoms are being infringed, they're probably going to vote a Republican in the next election or whatever, right? So these are just ways that you can argue that the voter base generally increases, and therefore that's how you lose elections to the right. So let's do a super suggested activity, right? So imagine you're debating one of these motions that we just talked about, right? Imagine you're debating the Supreme Court motion, whatever, right? Someone drops a super big right-wing backlash argument on you, and they're like, your policy is going to mobilize the right, that's going to lead to a whole bunch of bad administrations, whatever, right? Think about how you'd respond, right? Think about how you would refute to that, and try and come up with as many responses as possible. Don't just come up with one, just come up with as many as you can, and we'll circle back and we'll kind of talk about the responses that you can give. Cool. So hopefully you were able to pause and come up with a couple of responses. Here's what I came up with. So whenever you're responding to right-wing arguments, if someone makes that argument about X policy or X action causing a surge in right-wingism, I think you can push back by saying a couple of ways. And this is the most intuitive stuff that you could probably almost say, right? So just be like, all right, well, we have 4 responses. Firstly, you're going to want to challenge their characterization. Ask yourself, does it actually make them mad? For example, if the motion you're debating is about like increasing taxes on the rich or something, or a policy that would hurt the rich, and they're like, wow, increasing taxes on the rich is bad because the right wing is going to get angry and it's going to mobilize them, right? You can challenge this characterization by saying, look, right wing populists appeal to the average worker. They don't really care about policies that harm the rich if it helps the average conservative worker. Therefore, we don't think it's going to actually mobilize the right wing, right? Or if you're talking about like a policy that would be good for the LGBTQ community, and then the other side is just like, this is bad because it will mobilize the right wing, you can just contest the characterization that most of the right wing cares about like gay rights and stuff. And you can just be like, look, maybe if this motion was debated 20 years ago, your argument would be true. But now the right is usually like debating on other topics. They've moved away from that homophobic policy making, at least in the US. So therefore, like this argument really like doesn't matter, right? Whatever. The second response that I think you can do is like challenge the trend line. Just like ask them, what is the trend line here? Like, why would the right wing become super mad at this specific policy but not mad at any of the other dozens of policies that are being passed on the daily under Biden's administration, right? Like, why is this the tipping point, right? And this is the best way to wash their argument, because if you can prove that even if you don't pass your policy, some other like external factor still causes the right wing to mobilize, then you can just be like, it's non-unique. It doesn't cause that big of a difference. So you can still vote for us, right? Thirdly, though, you can say that the scope doesn't increase, only the intensity does. So remember, you prove that like their voter base does not increase by numbers. So if you have 1,000 Republicans, those 1,000 Republicans can get as mad as they want. It's not going to change the outcome of the election insofar as the voter base doesn't increase in numbers, right? So if you say that there's no net increase in red voters, then none of their impacts actually happen because Republicans don't win the election, right? And fourthly, though, and I think this should always be your safety net response, is just that there's more accountability when there's a surge in right wingism, right? So just be like, if a whole bunch of like conservatives turn out and start like campaigning and start like showing up to elections, then that is going to receive proportional accountability from the left, right? The left is also going to mobilize because they're scared of the right, and therefore they're always going to be even. They're always going to hold each other accountable. And that's why they're always going to be like neck and neck in elections. You can point towards like the Biden versus Trump election, where like the election was super, super close and progressives still got ahead in the end, right? So, or like progressives still got ahead in the end, right? Because we're not sure about Joe Biden, but yeah. The last thing that I want to talk about though is about authoritarian elite theory, right? And so this is just basically about the oligarchic regimes that we talked about earlier, right? And remember, those type of regimes are just regimes, authoritarian regimes that are upheld by oligarchies. They're upheld by the super rich. They're upheld by the ultra wealthy in the countries, and they rely on each other. The regime relies on the wealthy relies on the regime, right? And so authoritarian elite theory argues, or it is the belief that in a oligarchy authoritarian regime, if the elites leave the regime, then the entire regime falls apart with it, right? So how do you use this in debate? I think that if you're ever debating like an international relations motions that deals with authoritarian countries, this is a great way to argue liberation from the regime, more accountability, etc. Right? So, for example, let's say you're debating this nice little motion about this House supports an immediate end to the U.S. embargo on Cuba, right? So you could argue that authoritarians are going to leave the regime when the free market expands within Cuba, right? So if American markets engage more with Cuban private markets, then the incentives of the elites flip, right? Remember, elites care about money. That's all they care about, right? So if there's more money to be made in a private market with the U.S. And Cuba, then they would make with like Cubans communist command economy, then they're probably no longer going to want to support the regime, and instead they want to like support a booming free market where they will make mad money, and therefore the regime goes away because they no longer receive support from the ultra wealthy in the country, right? This is a good way to argue how the regime will fall apart in if there is an end to the U.S. embargo. The second thing though is just about like another example would be on the motion, this House believes that Russian containment is a priority for geopolitical stability, right? You can argue that containment are like sanctions, and that sanctions are crucial to limiting the elites that uphold Russia's regime, right? And so it'd be like, if we place targeted sanctions on like elites or like on Putin or the administration or whatever, the oligarchs that support the regime are going to get scared because they do not want to get blacklisted by the US. They don't want to get sanctioned. They don't want to get harmed, right? So they're going to move away from Putin because they know that Putin has a large target on his back. And therefore, if they dip out, if they say, peace out, we don't want to mess with you no more, Putin, then Putin's regime falls apart. They no longer have the support of the wealthy, of the oligarchy. And therefore, it becomes significantly easier to hold hold Russia's government accountable as they're no longer supported by super rich people. And then the regime was stopped, right? And so, yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you guys now. I mean, the only thing I have left is just resources, which I think are pretty helpful. As always, Second Thought is a nice, fun YouTube channel that I think everyone should like check out. Probably like it breaks the surface levels of common topics. If you have like 10 minutes before an impromptu round, just watch a single video, and you might get lucky, and it'll be the exact topic you were researching. But yeah, and then also if you're thinking about like reading a new book over the summer or something, I think Democracy in Decline is a great book that talks about how authoritarianism looks like in modern times, how certain crises actually lead to more to a rise in authoritarianism, and also it talks about like the surge in right wingism in places like Europe, and how that's and what specific policies, what specific actions, and like things triggered that surge in the first place, right? So this is like very, very good for those type of arguments, right? And lastly, and the most important resource of all is my email, right? If you guys have any questions at all about anything, even outside of this lecture, feel free to hit me up on my email. I will try and respond. If I don't respond though, you can like, I don't know, double email me, double text me, whatever. I won't get annoyed. I'll do my best to get back to you. But anyway, thank you guys a whole bunch for watching my lecture. It was awesome. But yeah, see y'all later.